The topic for today I picked was Thixotropy, Quartz Inversions, and Other Pottery Mysteries. And the reason for the weird title is I've realized over the years that there's a lot of terminology out there, sometimes some sort of complicated or confusing terminology that gets thrown around. And a lot of times it's used incorrectly, or people don't even know what it is, but they still continue to throw it around. So I thought I've been collecting a bunch of terms here that I thought it'd be worth talking about just to sort of help define them. And the main thing is also, I think, is explain the relevance. Is like what is Thixotropy? Why do we care even? You know, why do you even care what the term is? So really the purpose of the talk is going to be like to define the term, explain what it is, and how does it relate to what we do? What's the important? Is it important? Something we should be concerned about or not? Or is it just a term that people throw around? So now we're going to be talking about like wet clay, the wet stage in the process. And the first term that people throw around is preferred orientation. And what they mean by that is, what you may, I'm going to get one of my visual aids here. Clay, the structure of clay particles are not little round balls. They're actually like they're called platelets. They're little flat sheets. So the structure of clay actually looks like this. So the fact that the clay particles are not round, that you can think of them as little decks of cards, basically like this, and they're stacked in all different directions. But the fact that they're not round, it means that they can be oriented in certain ways. They could all be lying flat, or they could all be standing up, or different combinations. And the complication comes in the fact that the properties of clay are not the same in the different directions. So when clay dries and shrinks, it shrinks more in this direction than it does in this direction. So it really matters, for example, which way the clay particles are oriented in something you make out of clay, because that's going to mean it's going to shrink more in one direction than another when it dries. It really matters when you get into something like, let's say you're throwing a cup form, and so you have a dry marker. That's why they call them dry markers, by the way. So you're throwing, let's say, a cup form, and you put a handle on it. Well, the problem, normally when you throw it, if I represent one of these little stacks of cards sort of schematically like that, this is like looking edge on at one of these little decks of cards. As a result of throwing, the little particles in the wall of the mug tend to be oriented like that. But as a result of forming the handle, the little particles in the handle tend to be oriented like that. This is the worst possible situation right there, because I've got the two different orientations of the clay against each other, and they're shrinking completely opposite. This one is shrinking more this way, this is shrinking more this way. This is one of the reasons why handles tend to separate. Because I've got the worst possible situation. I've got the one direction where the clay shrinks the most against the one where the clay shrinks the least. So the term preferred orientation, it doesn't literally mean the clay prefers to be that in direction. It just means there's a certain orientation. There's a dominant sort of orientation of the clay particles. So if I roll out a slab of clay, if I roll out a slab of clay, for example, and here's looking at it sort of in cross section, when I start out, the clay particles kind of look like this. They're all oriented randomly, kind of like they are in this model. There's no particular orientation to all these little stacks of cards. But when I roll out the slab, they end up being oriented like that, depending on how much I press on the slab and how much I compress it. And I may end up with, for instance, you know, we're all probably familiar with the way like slabs of clay can warp when you dry them. Well, if you don't do a good job rolling out a slab, and let's say I roll it and I orient the particles like this, and I don't roll both sides so that they're oriented more like that on the other side, this can't stay flat when it dries. Because this bottom part here is going to shrink more in this direction than the top part, which means it's going to do that. That slab can't possibly stay flat when it dries, because the preferred orientation, or simply the orientation of the particles, is different on the bottom than on the top. So this is the reason why we should care about orientation, because every time we touch wet clay, we're changing the orientation of the particles, just pushing on them. If I have a block of clay, and it doesn't have to be a lot of pressure, if I have a block of clay and it starts out kind of randomly, and I just put my finger and push on it, I orient the particles under where I push, like that. So depending on the amount of force or pressure I put on the clay and how much I work it or don't work it, I'm changing the orientation of the particles. So it really helps to be aware of what you're doing to the clay, because it contributes to whether things crack or warp later on in the firing or during the drying. So it's important to think about in terms of the orientation. What are we doing to the clay particles? Okay, any questions on that?
Yeah, what, on a bowl or maybe especially a flat bottom bowl, what about the contrast between the sides and the bottom?
Well, that's a really good question, because, and that's the like S cracks on the bottom.
Yeah.
This is the reason for S cracks, because when you throw a bowl, I'm doing it in an easy way here. As a result of throwing, the walls tend to be oriented like that. The bottom, unless you probably heard the thing also when you're throwing, you want to compress the bottom of the pot. You also want to compress the rim, but you want to compress the bottom. If you don't compress the bottom, you end up with the clay more or less randomly oriented, like it was in the original lump you put on the wheel. So the problem is now when this dries and shrinks this way, and then this dries but shrinks a lot, and you get the problem is you get a difference in drying shrinkage between the walls and the bottom, and that's basically what causes the cracks in the bottom.
I've always been wondering how that works though when you throw up the hump, because you could keep going down.
That's the problem with throwing off the hump, is you can't compress the bottom very effectively. That's the real problem, because when you go to push, there's nothing to So it's that's a classic thing about why a lot of cups and things thrown off the hump end up with S cracks.
I'm wondering if you make sure that you define your bottom, giving the pressure in, that might help define a...
Not that much. What really helps is then when you trim it, compress it again. It's when you trim it, you can take your finger or a rib and compress the bottom from the outside, and that'll help do some orientation on the bottom. Assuming also you're not throwing really big pieces off the hump. Typically they're small. So you could compress inside the foot ring on something thrown off the hump.
If it's too dry, then you can't then though, right? Like you have to wait. It has to be like leather hard, up to leather hard, or
up to leather hard. Even once it starts getting hard leather hard, you're not changing the orientation. If not changing the orientation that much, so it has to be soft enough where you're moving you're sort of smearing and moving the clay particles around. Okay. But anyway, so preferred orientation. Like I say, it literally doesn't mean the clay prefers to be in that, and that's a little too like Aristotle, where everything had an intention. But in this case, it just means that there is an orientation, that the clay particles tend to be oriented more one way or the other. And the more you work the clay, whether you're throwing with your fingers or rolling out a slab or whatever you're doing, or pinching it, you're increasing the amount of orientation. You're making it more and more and more and more oriented in one direction. And that creates problems because of the fact that the clay doesn't behave the same in its different directions. So you have to be aware about, like with the handle, what happens when I have these two completely different orientations coming up right against each other. This is the reason why scoring and slipping is done. Because when you score it, you create a little zone here that's not this orientation and not that orientation, and it acts like a transition between the two.
Can you over-compress?
Not really. Not really. Okay, any questions on that?
So when you pull a handle, and so you're attaching it using the pull handle technique, and you push it on the left, does that pushing on the surface of the pot also help to align the clays in this
Yeah, when you push, like if here's the wall of the pot, and let's say you've got this lump of clay that you're gonna push in this way. If you pulled it, the orientation was mostly like that. But when you push it, then you're changing some of them to sort of, because you're pushing it, and when you push on clay, the particles orient perpendicular to the direction you're pushing. So when you push, even if they all started out like this, you tend to change some of them into oriented like that, which is closer to what they are like in the wall. So that's a good thing, because you're getting sort of a condition halfway between what was in the handle and what was in the wall. Okay. Now, if you smear clay, like I said, if you just push into clay, you tend to orient the particles like that. If you smear the clay, then you orient them parallel to the direction you're smearing, which makes sense. Think of like a deck of cards, and you can take a deck of cards and you can slide the cards. It's exactly analogous to the way a stack of cards would behave. If you smear them, they all lie down and they all sort of end up parallel. And if you push them, they turn opposite the way your finger is pushing.
That's pretty remarkable, really. I've never heard that.
And what's amazing is, what's really amazing about this is that all the properties of clay that we like about wet clay are due to this. And these particles are about the size of your red blood corpuscles. These are incredibly tiny, and yet this is dictating all the properties of the clay. Second one I had was clay memory. And whether you, again, you may have heard of this. This is where, has everybody heard of that term? That clay has a tendency to sort of, if you have a block of clay and you push on it a little bit, it has a tendency, it wants to sort of go back to where it was, especially if it was in that position for a while. That's all due to the clay particles again. If the clay particles weren't these little flat plates, you wouldn't have clay memory. And the reason why is because let's say I'll just have one little stack of clay particles. Now this is one little tiny part of a big chunk of clay. And if I push on it a little bit, and so I displace them so that it sort of looks like that, they're so close together and the attraction between them is so great that they actually want to move back. So if I have hundreds and thousands and millions of these little units that are only moved a little bit, together it's like a spring. I have all these little things that add up, and if I don't push them too far, if I just kind of move them a little bit, they're close enough to where they were, they just want to move back to where they were. But again, it's only because it's of the platelet shape. If the clay had a shape that was like little ball bearings, it wouldn't have a memory. So it's it's real. It's a real effect. It's the fact that you've seen it sometimes with a leather hard piece. You'll bend it, and then you have a pot and you bump the rim when you're trimming it. So you bend it back, and when you fire it comes out, the dent is back again because the clay particles, you've moved them not enough to where they're going to stay in the new position. If you just move them a little bit, each little bit adds up, and they go back to where they were. So it's a real effect. But it's due to the shape of the clay particles.
So Phil, if you have dented the rim of a bowl and you want to put it back to its original shape, how do you do it such that it won't snap back?
I do it a little bit at a time. Don't just push it. Kind of coax it. Because again, think of all these little tiny particles like as if you don't want to break them apart. So I'll move it a little bit at a time and then go past the point where you want it to be and then bring it back. So push it, so a little bit at a time, coax it, go past, let's say it got dented in, push it even further than you want, and then come back a little bit to where you want. And that usually helps a lot. But again, I don't just bend it, I sort of coax it. And part of this, that same thing you brought about wiggling it when you attach it, I do kind of a little bit of sort of pushing it, because I'm trying to get it, I don't want to just bend it and snap it. I'm trying to get all these little particles to move, so I coax it. I push it a little bit at a time, push it past, bring it back. Next one is sort of in the decorating stage, and the word that I thought of was engobe. We talked about this last time, but I collected it under this thing today. And this is a term that's really misused a lot, and I think is technically speaking, well, let's backtrack. A slip, by definition, strict definition, is clay and water. That's a slip. We've gotten kind of looser in our way we've used some of these terms, and now, regardless almost of what in it, if it has wet clay and a whole lot of other stuff, we still call it a slip. An engobe technically is clay plus other things such as a flux, which we'll talk about. A flux is something that helps things melt. So an engobe, technically speaking, is not just clay and water. It's clay and water and other things, especially like a flux. Okay. And for example, an underglaze is actually a kind of engobe.
Because I was going to say there's different times you use an engobe. I mean, right? Or is it always just leather hard?
No, you could use it. You can use it on freshly thrown clay if you wanted to, but typically it's on leather hard or even bisqueware.
Well, that's what I'm saying. Is like this you can use on bisqueware, but there's like just a slip, clay and water. You wouldn't use on a bisque piece.
You could.
You can.
You can. Yeah, you'd have to adjust the consistency of the slip, but you could. We're going to talk about that. But one difference between an engobe and a slip is typically you don't build up a big thickness with an engobe. Typically an engobe is meant to modify the surface color or the surface characteristics of a piece. Like you want to change the color of the clay on the surface. Usually you don't use an engobe to get texture. Like you can make slips really thick, like the consistency of icing on a cake, and you can do different things with it and comb them and build a texture. Typically you wouldn't use, again, I'm sticking to the strict definition of an engobe here. You wouldn't use an engobe to do that, you just use a slip. An engobe typically is just to change the color or the texture or some surface property of the clay. And as I say, commercial underglaze is actually a good example, because underglazes typically contain a colorant, they contain a flux like a glass frit, and they contain a brushing aid. And they're never made to put on big, thick layers. They're only made to put on a thin coating to change the color of the surface. That's a typical use for an engobe. But we've gotten really loose in the way I don't even know whether people even use this term much anymore, because nowadays people talk about slips and they can have all kinds of things in them, and technically they're engobes. So maybe it's almost an obsolete term now with the way we use terminology anymore. Because you hear about flashing slips, for instance, that people put on for wood firing and soda firing, and they're clay plus nepheline cyanide and a whole lot of other fluxes. So technically they're engobes, but nobody calls them engobes anymore. So maybe this may even be more or less of an obsolete term. Okay? Okay. Another one related to this area is terra sigillata. Terra sigillata. Terra sigillata is a really, really, really dilute slip, basically. You take clay, for example, the way you make it is you mix it with water and clay, and then you let it settle out. And typically when you let it settle out in water, you get the heavy stuff and the coarser material settles to the bottom, and then you end up with this sort of milky looking region in the middle, and then typically clear water at the top. The milky looking region in the middle is the terra sigillata. It's the finest particles in the clay, and they're so fine that they actually don't settle out quickly in water. That's what you want. And terra sigillata is typically applied in very thin coatings, either for two reasons. Usually, again, to change the surface of the clay. You might put terra sigillata on something to change the color. So you might have, let's say, a darker clay body, and you put a terra sigillata coating of a white terra sigillata to give a white surface clay appearance. The other thing it's also used for is to produce a really fine surface for burnishing. Like a lot of clay bodies, if you it's hard to produce a really good shine when you burnish them. You're rubbing it with something. Well, the terra sigillata it doesn't have any grit in it, so to speak of. It only has these tiny little, again, think of clay particles. It only has these tiny little things shaped like that. And they all lie down on the surface, like fish scales almost on the outside of a fish, and so you almost naturally get a smooth, shiny surface because all these little platelets are lying flat on the surface. It could. So terra sigillata is typically just clay and water, but it's the trick is it's the absolute finest particles. And again, you don't put thick layers of terra sigillata. For one thing, it would be too difficult to make it. When you put it on, it's the consistency sort of skim milk. And it literally is kind of like cloudy water. So you don't think about putting terra sig on and building up a thick layer. Typically, you put multiple coats on, and you paint it on, let it soak in, let it dry a little bit, put another coat on until you get the thickness or you get the opacity, the hiding of the surface underneath that you want. But it's typically used for those two reasons: to change the color of the surface or the surface characteristics, and especially for things like burnishing. If you have a clay body that doesn't burnish well, you can put a thin layer of terra sigillata on it, and then you burnish the terra sigillata layer. And this burnishes really nicely because it's all these little flat flakes that just lie down when you rub them and give you this really nice smooth surface.